Metroid II: Return of Samus, released in 1991 for the Nintendo Game Boy, and judging by the big old Roman numeral 2 in the title, serving as the sequel to the original Nintendo classic, once again places you in the role of famed bounty hunter Samus, tasked with the mission of heading into planet SR-388 to wipe out the entire Metroid race before they grow into a threat to the rest of the galaxy. Now, I want you folks to go back to a time when Nintendo of America was this family-friendly company who censored the violence in Mortal Kombat for its Super Nintendo appearance, purged Wolfenstein 3D of all Nazi references. Basically, if it wasn't family-friendly, it did not touch a Nintendo console. This is the Nintendo that would put out a game in 1991, a first-party Nintendo game, mind you, where the main objective was mass genocide. How this game got remade into a 3DS game, but I digress. Metroid II shows it means business by starting you off with a rather modest arsenal of equipment. 30 missiles, a long-range pea shooter, and the morph ball ability right out of the suit. You're given just enough to deal with some of the Metroid menace, but obviously not enough to deal with all of it, so naturally you'll have to find additional equipment along the way, some of which is familiar wares from the first game such as ice beams, high jump boots, and the screw attack among others. In addition, there are also new toys to play with such as the spider ball, which lets you cling to walls in ball form, as well as the spring ball, which lets you jump in ball form, which is a much appreciated new ability. In addition to starting off with a rather modest arsenal of equipment and some new toys to play with along the way, Samus also acquired two new abilities that would benefit her greatly in future adventures, namely the ability to crouch, a useful move that lets you shoot enemies half your size, and the ability to shoot downwards, which might not seem like much now, but when you're making the jump from Metroid 1 to Metroid 2, oh boy, it makes all the difference in the world, folks. As previously stated, your main goal in Metroid II: Return of Samus is to eliminate Metroids, and thus you have a little counter indicating the total number of Metroids left to exterminate. You pause the game, this counter is replaced with a much smaller number, the number of Metroids left to clear out in a designated area. Aside from the original life suckers and the Metroid Queen who resides in the final segment of the game, you'll be encountering 4 variants of Metroid through various stages of their evolution, from the smaller alphas to the much larger omegas. These are in essence your boss battles in Metroid 2. Numerous, yes, but after a while they seem tired, which is why they have to change the terrain to vary things up a bit. But beating these Metroids is one step closer to your goal, and unless you clear out all the Metroids in a designated area, you cannot progress forward as indicated by this lava pool engulfing the lower levels. This results in a game that is decisively more linear than its predecessor, and something of a point of contention for many Metroid fans back in the day, the very reason for this game's supposed black sheep status. In all fairness though, there is some semblance of exploration in the game, and you still have to seek out tools and weapons to navigate further, but it does still feel fairly limiting and makes the world of Metroid 2 seem much smaller than the original, even though there's probably more terrain to explore. Despite this, the game plays fine. The controls are tight, you have your usual toys from the previous game along with a few new goodies, and you also have save points you could save your progress to, which is a marked improvement over Metroid's somewhat shoddy password system, or even the save system of the original disk system version. Graphically speaking, Metroid is a bit of a mixed bag, better in some ways than the original Metroid but worse off in others. Being that the original Game Boy's color palette was limited to 4 shades of spinach, Metroid 2 focused on adding more visual detail to the overall graphics. This is immediately evident with Samus, who looks like someone sporting a highly sophisticated spacesuit rather than someone in a tracksuit and a mushroom head. And speaking of which, Metroid 2 is also the game that introduced the updated Varia suit to Metroid canon. See, because the Game Boy lacked color, the game designers had to come up with some clever way to differentiate Samus's normal power suit and the Varia upgrade, the end result being big rounded shoulder modules added to the shoulders that would be a trademark look for the character for the remainder of the series. Some of the rock tiles look somewhat nicer, and the creature designs are rather nice looking, but much like in Metroid, terrain comes across as somewhat repetitive looking, giving the world of Metroid 2 a bit of sameness with similar looking rocks and a pitch black background. The lack of color somewhat enforces this sense of deja vu in its environments. When you head to the ruins, it provides a bit of difference in the block scenery such as it is, but for the most part, it gets to a point where you've been here before, especially towards the end of the game, where a lot of terrain from the old game is recycled somewhat, I suppose. Metroid 2 doesn't have much of a soundtrack, only a handful of original songs, ambient noises, and a couple jingles from the original game. The main theme that plays during a good chunk of the game is pretty decent, as are a couple tunes that play during the final segments of the game. The background ambience that plays during the various caverns can get pretty irritating after a while. I could appreciate the attempt by the developers to create some semblance of atmosphere with the audio, but the end result made me appreciate the ability to turn down the volume so much more. Sound effects are alright. I like the sound of the Metroid snarls, it gives them a bit more of a sinister edge. Overall, Metroid II Return of Samus on Game Boy is a perfectly acceptable portable entry in a series that, up to that point, only had one other game under its belt. And given the number of improvements that Metroid 2 has made over its NES predecessor, it's a shame the trade-off had to be the free-roaming non-linear progression that had become the Metroid's series trademark. Well, like any good sequel, Metroid 2 manages to improve upon the original formula with its enhanced visuals and somewhat improved control mechanics. And while it's not the complete non-linear adventure that its predecessor was, the game is still a solid and competent sequel and a stepping stone for the series' next entry, as many of the items and elements hailed in the incredible Super Metroid for the SNES had their start right here. And if you haven't had the chance to play Metroid 2, then you're doing yourself a great disservice by skipping this one. It's a pretty good game, and unlike the first game, it still pretty much holds up.